Thank you very much, Roy, and also thank you to the Water Institute. I really welcome the opportunity to, I should say, come back to Waterloo because I've got a long-time connection with the Canadian Water Network, spanning, I hate to say it, about 17 years. So I've been to Waterloo a fair number of times, and I always welcome the opportunity to see how it's changed, because it has changed a lot over the last few years. So first of all, I want to thank Water Economics Policy and Governance Network for the funding for this particular research. And I would say Canadian Water Network for having belief in me, an economist amongst all the engineers, so many years ago to actually fund some of my original research that really kickstarted a lot of this. This work is joint work with James Price, who was a postdoc who has sadly gone on to work for the EPA, and I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing. I think he's looking for other positions at this very instant. Vic Adamovich, who is out at University of Alberta, and I would say Canada's best known non-market valuation. In fact, probably in the world, one of the best known non-market valuation specialists. And Pat Lloyd-Smith, who is a doctoral candidate at the University of Alberta. So my title's a bit of a misnomer. I am going to talk about floods, and by droughts I really mean unreliable water supply. So drought in your house, not drought on the land, but certainly this work could be expanded to that. So let me give you a little bit of overview of what I want to talk about. I want to give you a bit of motivation for what I'm doing, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about non-market valuation, because I know this is an interdisciplinary audience. I told Roy that I was going to do it in 2 slides, and he said, okay, let's see what you do. So I'm going to do it in 2 slides, and then I'll give a little bit of a literature review. There is some literature in this area that I'm looking at. Then I want to talk mostly about the survey that I developed with Pat and Vic and James, and the data, a little bit about econometrics, and then kind of bring it back to some conclusions. So let me give you a bit of a background here. Bernadette will know all of this. And if we kind of think from a policy perspective what's going on here, we think ultimately Canadian water and sewage agencies are facing a lot of challenges. I think I wrote that sentence about 20 years ago. It's still true, and I think the challenges are still the same. So I guess plus ça change is kind of the thing that's going on here. But aging infrastructure, that's a bit of a theme that's going on here. Inadequate revenues to kind of deal with the aging infrastructure. Rising demands, although that's being moderated a little bit with very aggressive pricing changes that we've seen in the last little while. And of course the big joker in the pack, which is climate change. And specifically what I want to think about is instances of too much water, floods, and too little water, kind of unreliable water supplies. Kind of 2 extremes of the same issue. So I had a hard time trying to find I'll show you my picture of a flood, which is really easy, but I had a hard time trying to find a picture of a drought or unreliable water supply. So there you go, there's your sink. You've gone down to the sink and you press the little, you turn the little tap and nothing comes out. How many times has this happened to you? Anybody? Yeah, lots of times. It depends on where you live. It can definitely happen. So there's situations where we don't have the water we expect. We have a very big expectations. We turn that tap and we're going to have water coming out of it. Sometimes we don't have water, or the water is kind of a little bit iffy. We're not too sure what's going on with it. So that's one of the issues that I want to talk about. And the other, of course, is flooding. Now, this is a parking lot. You might think, oh, this is Calgary 2013. No, it's Calgary 2016. So they've had it happen more than once. So clearly, flooding is an issue that obviously a lot of communities are having to deal with more and more. So 2 kind of extremes, as I said. Now, we know that this is important stuff because there is actually a Canadian disaster database. I'm sure you didn't know that, but if you go and you check, there's the Canadian Disaster Database, and they basically have a listing of different types of emergency situations that have happened in Canada over a very long historical period. Over the last 20 years, and I just focused on the last 20 years, there have been over something like 120 120 flooding events. About half of them have been caused by rainfall. And a lot of them have happened in basically the last decade. So the idea is that it's happening more frequently. Certainly at Toronto, almost every year, they have some kind of flooding incidents going on. Calgary, clearly it's happening as well. I don't think Kitchener particularly, or Waterloo has particularly had flooding. If you live in Winnipeg, Red River floods every year, so you know it's a kind of regular occurrence. So that's on the one hand, the case of too much water. But on the other hand, we also have water outages. And unfortunately, unlike flooding, there's really no database of water outages. It's very kind of anecdotal evidence. You hear someone's water's been off for a week or a couple of days. But what we do have is a bit of a proxy for, shall I say, unreliable water, which is really what I'm trying to get at here when I talk about water outages, which is the extent of boil water advisories. And boil water advisories are advisories issued by provincial ministries to say, something wrong with your water, don't use it. On any given day, there are over 1,400 boil water advisories in Canada. So you can kind of think about how prevalent they are. Now, obviously, they occur in certain locations with more frequency than others, but almost every community has had some kind of boil water advisory. So it's familiar with the notion of unreliable water. Now, if we think about starting to move back from the incidents and we think about what can an economist say or what would we want to say about what's going on here, I read a very influential article back, I think it was 2000, and it was in the American Water Resources Association Journal, which just really surprised me because largely it's engineers who write for that journal. And I was, as an economist, coming at that journal thinking, what information could this give me? And this article basically said words that were music to my ears. Essentially, what are people willing to pay for improvements to their water services? Now, willingness to pay is in the realm of economics because we really are trying to get at what value do people put on things. But the fact that the engineers were interested in knowing this, I thought was very enlightened. And then more generally, what are community priorities in terms of spending on infrastructure relating to potable water, infrastructure relating to wastewater management. So that's really what I'm looking at here is what are people willing to pay? How much value do people have for better water services? And in my specific case, it means a reduction in likelihoods of flooding on the one hand, and a reduction in the likelihood of water outages on the other hand. So scaling back from too much water, scaling back from too little water in some senses. So we might ask, well, this is tied up with infrastructure. Aren't current water prices that we pay sufficient to pay for to generate the revenues to pay for the infrastructure? And most people would argue that they're still probably too low. That even though they have been increasing since the mid-2000s, I know Toronto, for example, has been increasing in nominal terms their water prices at the rate of 8 to 10% a year. Now, they were very low to start. Have they gotten up to a situation where they've got sufficient revenues to offset the infrastructure costs? No, not quite there yet. So there's still scope for moving. Now, why is this important? Well, it gets at the heart again of a kind of a public policy issue, which is how much are we as a community, as a society, willing to pay for infrastructure that supports very valuable services to us? And a report was done, it's been done on an annual basis now for the last few years, called the, if you ever want dry reading, Canada Infrastructure Report. It's a report from 4 different agencies, including the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which worries a great deal about whether we have adequate water supply, whether we have adequate wastewater kinds of services. And I want to just give you a little bit of background from them, just to kind of set the tone for why we would care about how much are people willing to pay for infrastructure improvements, and is it going to be enough? So here's for potable water. This was the average annual reinvestment rate. So it's the amount of money, the revenues that are being taken in and reinvested in to keep the system maintained, okay? And the target, according to this organization, is they should be spending on the order of to 1% to 1.5% of the value of the assets. Now, linear assets are things like the lines, the pipes. The nonlinear assets are more like the buildings, okay? So you can see what the targets are. You can see what the current is, less than 1% for linear, about 1% for the nonlinear. So it's not even reaching kind of the targets. Now, how much is that in terms of dollar terms? Their estimate of the replacement value based on current reinvestment rates is about $14,000 per household. That's a lot of money. So we want to start thinking, because these are billions of dollars of assets that we're thinking about. So we want to think, are people maybe starting to be willing to pay that size of funding, if you will, out of their taxable dollars to help support the infrastructure. Now for wastewater, similar kinds of targets, although in terms of where we are of current reinvestment rates, you can see 7% is even lower than it was for potable water. So approximately more money is being spent on potable water than on wastewater asset reinvestment. And here we're looking at an even bigger required investment, over $16,000 per household, as an average kind of estimate of what's spending. So just to give you an idea, and I'm going to come back to these numbers at the end when I do my survey and I ask people how much are you willing to pay, we're going to compare how much people say they're willing to pay with some of these estimates of what the cost is. Okay, so let me move into non-market valuation approaches. So this is the one, actually I take it back, I lie, it's actually maybe more like 3 slides, sorry Roy. So what is a non-market valuation approach? So let's start off with some basic premises here. Households value access to potable water and to wastewater services. They provide valuable benefits to us. And those benefits, those values are expressed in economic terms as willingness to pay. How much I'm willing to give up in exchange for these better services. How much could you take away from me to say, yeah, those services are kind of the equivalent value in terms of the dollars you're taking away from me. There are different types of categories of values, by the way, that may be associated with water. But the problem for an economist is that a lot of these values are not expressed in a market setting. Now, economists like markets because in a market, you have a buyer and a seller. I go into a market, I plunk my money down and I walk off with the good. So I know what the value is for me. In the case of water, potable water infrastructure or wastewater infrastructure, I'm not going and buying, one little section of a pipe or one little part of a building, so I don't really know what the value of those resources happen to be for me. So that's why I have to use what's called a non-market valuation approach. Basically a kind of an approximation to the values that I'd expect to see in a market, recognizing that there is not a market for those things. Now, oh, my apologies. This is the slide that everyone goes, oh, she's written it too small. My apologies. I wanted to give you a sense of the complexity of the issue. Now, what is this thing? This is a framework that economists use in the non-market valuation setting. It's called the Total Economic Value Framework. And the idea is basically to take a resource like water and to break it down into the myriad types of, you guys talk about ecosystem services, these are the ecosystem services that we would get from water. And you can see the complexity. At the end of the day, these are the different kinds of services, and you can, the top part is kind of the terminology that we use. So if I were to think about potable water as a service to people, it would basically fall into here with domestic and in some cases industrial use of water. Obviously, domestic cases, we use water to drink. In the case of industrial, they use it for economic activity. So that would be an example of what's called a direct use value. Now, usually in economics for direct use values, we have markets for things. The problem is you can't go to your municipality and say, I don't like you selling water to me. I'm going to go to the municipality down the road and buy my water from you. It doesn't work that way. So we don't have a sense of a competitive market or how much value people are willing to pay in the price that they see. It's the price they have to pay, but they may have a much higher value. Now, in the case of flooding, basically what we talk about ecosystem services, we really don't have markets, and we really don't know the values that people place on things. So we have to rely on what's called non-market valuation. This is the 2 slides that I talk about. So this is the 5-minute discussion of how an economist would think about approaching getting at values that are essentially not measured, not available for ease for putting in, say, a cost-benefit analysis framework. There are basically 2 methods. One is called the indirect method, and one is called the direct method. Now, the indirect method says basically water services are related to things that we purchase in a market, so we're going to implicitly find the value of the water services by looking at the related market. And there are 3 different approaches or 3 different ways that people do this. One is called travel cost, and basically the argument would be, oh, I like to go fishing. Where's Mark? No, he's not. Mark Service is not here. Mark loves to fish. I like to go fishing, so whatever I spend on my travel time and my boat and my fishing gear and everything, that's going to give me a sense of the value to me of going to that particular activity and enjoying the water at, say, that particular lake. So that'll give me an estimate of the value. Another approach is what's called hedonics, and This is very low. It's interesting right now in the Toronto housing market where we're getting huge values in properties. It's all location, location, location. That would be an example of hedonics. The value that people put on living in Toronto is a premium well above an equivalent type of house in another setting. So we could use a kind of hedonics there. And we often use it for water. We'll look and ask, how much are people willing to live by the ocean? So everyone's gone to a hotel and they know if you want to be in an oceanfront hotel room, it's going to cost you more money. Whether you pay that or not would kind of give you a sense of the value. So that's hedonics. And then averting behavior, I think a lot of people are familiar with. I've got my little bottle of water here somewhere. Used to be the case that people would buy, and still do buy, bottled water because they don't trust the water that's coming out of their tap. How many people here buy bottled water because they don't like their tap water? No? Okay, all right. Or use a Brita filter. Okay, so there you go. So the idea here is that there's an assumption that there's something not quite right, and you have to pay money to defend yourself about it. And that gives you a sense then of the value of the good part of the water. So that's indirect methodologies, but what I'm going to talk about is direct methodology, because in the case of flooding and in the case of water unreliability, we really can't get at it through, well, we can actually get a little bit through it through indirect methods, but we want to move more to direct methods. So this is the kind of preferred approach that is taken these days to find the values for non-market goods. Direct methodology, and basically we use surveys. And we use surveys and we try to set up a kind of a pseudo market within which people can express their values. And they're roughly speaking two different ways that we actually ask a valuation question. One is called contingent valuation. Basically, you would be told, your property may be flooded with this probability, and these different circumstances might happen. Would you pay X amount of dollars to insure it? That would be an example of a contingent valuation question. You can't change any of those little aspects of the so-called scenario. You just express a single value, and that's all we know. Alternatively, more and more, and Roy is at the forefront of doing this kind of work, working with what are called choice experiments or choice tasks. We think about an environmental good and we kind of break it down in its component attributes. And then we allow people to kind of pick and choose between the attributes and to express a preference for different aspects of the attributes. And this will become a little bit clearer in a second when I talk about my particular scenario. But essentially the idea here is with a choice experiment, we can get at much finer values for different components of a particular scenario. In the case of a contingent valuation, you get an all or nothing valuation. And so if you want to be more careful about your analysis, better to do a choice experiment. Just one last thing before I leave this. I think most of you have heard about the Exxon Valdez, which was when oil spilled from an oil tanker back in the late 1980s. It really kick-started this whole non-market valuation set of efforts in the US, largely for litigation purposes in court. They used a contingent valuation scenario, and it's been only in the last, say, since about 2000 that choice experiments have really kind of taken off, which is, now 17 years. But this is kind of firmly in place of what people use. Okay, so I have to give you a little picture because this is about survey work. So here's God, and he says, well, this survey will only take 5 minutes. Actually, it might take about 25, and will help me improve future floods. So there you go. This is not to improve future floods, but I'm really trying to find out how much people are willing to pay to kind of avoid future floods, shall we say. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the literature review on this. And I won't go into a lot of detail. I really want to do it to kind of set you up so you can see where what I'm doing both follows from the existing literature and then kind of takes off from the existing literature. So the way I want to do this is there are kind of two parts to this. Basically, remember, I'm going to be talking about survey work. So people have used surveys, either contingent valuation or choice experiment type surveys to find the values of either water outages, unreliable water, not enough, or too much water, flooding. They haven't put them together. And that's what I've done. In a single survey, I've kind of put them together. So let me talk about what people have done. So on the water reliability, the willingness to pay for more reliable water, in other words, not having water outages. There's a lot of literature, not surprisingly, coming out of the dry Midwest US, that's the Griffin and Mielda, and out of Australia. That's the Hensher and the Hatton McDonald and the Willis, where they've really had to worry a great deal about water scarcity and water outages. They've looked at everything from how much are people willing to pay to avoid a couple of hours of water outage, to a couple of days of water outage, to not being able to use water for outdoor use, to having no water at all. That was Australia. That was an extreme situation. Sometimes the papers have looked at water as what's called a private good. So in other words, my household enjoyment, I just think about my problems with not having enough water as opposed to a public good. So the public system is not working, so other people are being affected. And so we talk about what are called public goods versus private goods in that case. Just as an aside there, what we generally expect is if we're talking about putting a value on a public good, then we're thinking not only of our own benefits, but benefits to other people. So there's a kind of an altruism aspect to it. So expect to have larger values for those things as opposed to just paying to make things better for myself. There's been a mix of both contingent valuation and choice experiment approaches in this. The values that people have found are very context specific. They depend on the way the scenario is described. But roughly speaking, on the papers that I've seen, they range from a couple of dollars, those are for, avoiding a few hours of water outage, to about $40 a year in different situations per household. So just to kind of give you a sense of scale, so when you look at my numbers, you'll see what the literature has found. Oh, sorry. And then the other part of the literature, of course, is the willingness to pay to avoid flooding events. Now, this one is a little more developed in some senses, and it's a little more complex as well because there are a lot of different aspects associated with this. But the very first article, actually, that I could find that looked at willingness to pay, in other words, how much people value being able to avoid or being in a flooding situation, was from 1991, and it was about basically property loss values, so very much private home loss values, but as well some kind of more ecosystem, non-property types of values were attached. So it was a very, very early survey. It was a CV survey. And then more recently, and Roy is one of the authors on one of these papers, in Holland, there's been a lot of course, they worry about flooding, and there's been a lot of effort to look at how much people are willing to pay, expressed in terms of insurance premiums that they're willing to pay up front for in order to protect their property. Now, that's not what I'm going to be talking about in my particular case, but that is very much a part of this particular literature. Again, a mix of CV and CE approaches. The values tend to be higher per household than the ones to avoid water outages. That seems to make a lot of sense to me. One seems to be more of an issue than the other, but there are no direct comparisons because they're not done in the same survey. They've been done in different surveys. So the values range from about $60 a household to about $800. It's hard to compare exactly what's going on because these are very, very much specific to the context in which the scenario has been described. Okay, so that's the background. So let me talk about my survey. So this was an online survey done in, about a year ago now, May, April 2016. We worked with a company to put it online, and then people were contacted by email and they could choose to do the survey or not. At the end of the day, we had just over 1,600 adult Canadians. One of the important things we have to worry about in Canada, of course, is the population representative of the general population. So it is in terms of the observables, so roughly the same proportions of people who live in the different provinces are represented in the survey. Roughly the same gender kind of balance is represented in the survey. Kind of median income matches up and so on. So we collected, in addition to all the demographic kind of information that you'd want to know about people, we asked them what their background flood and water outage experience had been. So have you ever had a water outage? Have you ever experienced a flood and different kind of manifestations? Because we wanted to know what was the context within which they would be answering the questions. We also asked them their deferred, what we call defensive or averting expenditures. So for example, if someone had maybe taken all of their valuables from their basement and bought boxes and put them up on a first or second floor, that would be an example of a defensive expenditure, would be a representation at least of how much people want to spend in order to avoid adverse outcomes from a flooding situation. In the case of water outages, quite often what we observe is people buying like 18 liters of water, like a big carboy of water to have just in case their water goes out. So again, that's an example of an averting expenditure. In addition, we asked, because so much we're asking people for their behavior, so we want to know a little bit more about the motivations that drive this behavior. And one of the big motivations that we worry about, of course, is do people have so-called environmental perspectives on things? And so we asked a series of what are called Likert-style questions about relating to environmental concerns, about their views on public policies and things like that, just to, again, to try to categorize people. And for those of you who don't know what a Likert scale question is, you've probably encountered one. If you've ever done a survey and they ask you, we want to know how important this issue is to you on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is not important at all and 5 is the most important, that's a Likert scale question. So it's trying to get people to kind of give us a relative sense of importance about things. One of the things that we also did, and we thought this was really important, since our scenarios are all about reducing risks or probabilities associated with these different kinds of adverse outcomes, flooding and water outages. Let me take a step back here for a second. Typically when people do these kinds of surveys, they take for granted that everybody has the same base information about what's called status quo, the current situation. And then they say, okay, here's the new situation. Are you willing to pay money to move from the status quo to the new situation? So typically it's just assumed that the respondents have the same information as the researchers. But in this particular case, we're basically asking people, how much are you willing to pay to have a reduction in your flood probability? It's going to vary if I live in Winnipeg versus if I live in Kitchener, if I live somewhere else. So we needed to get at what we call people's subjective views or valuations of what they think their own personal risk was in a baseline situation. So we asked them their perceptions of expected frequency of these adverse events, outages, and flooding. We'd already asked them, have you experienced this? We then asked them to express in kind of a probabilistic sense, which is a whole other issue, what they thought the risk would be in the future for them going forward. And then we asked them willingness to pay questions relating to this reduction in the probability of these different events. So before I go on and talk a little bit more about the questions, people always like to see data. So just in case you thought you wanted to know kind of relatively where people thought about the importance of different kinds of public programs, we asked people the relative importance, this was a Likert scale question, on different kinds of public spending initiatives. So there are only so many government dollars. They're going to be spent on education, roads, transportation, water, sewer. Where do those things fit in? And these are the Likert scale questions. So people are not ranking these things. I will say this first off. So these things are not mutually exclusive. Okay. So, but what I thought was most important is I looked at the percentage of the sample who gave something a 5, the most important thing for each of these different categories. And clean, reliable water supply had the highest percentage of people saying this is the most important thing, 73%. And you can see where flood control and management, it's down there at the same level as policing, basically, only about 28%. So it gives us a sense, and it's really important to understand, if this is what people are saying, these are their priorities in effect, it gives us some confidence in their responses to our willingness to pay questions. And food, restaurant safety is kind of right down there at the bottom. They still want some government involvement there, but clearly clean, reliable water supply is very important. But if you got them to choose between sewer and schools, they'd pick schools. So just so you know where these different things kind of lie on the scale of importance for people. Okay, so let me give you a couple of facts, I guess, from the survey on kind of people's background experiences, their experiences with flooding events, outage events, and some of their expenditures as well. So 13% of the people in the sample said they had experienced a water outage in the last year. So I think here when I asked people, I didn't ask you the last year, it was only a couple of people. 13% out of over 1,600, that's a fair number of people who've had a water outage. That's important because that means our questions about paying are going to be salient. They've had experience, so they can actually answer the question with some confidence. 13% said they had experienced a flood-related boil water advisory in the last 10 years. So this is not just a boil water advisory because, you know, the city's turned off your water and now you've got brown water or whatever. This is a flood-related boil water advisory. 26% experienced street flooding in the last 10 years, and I think they were a lot of people from Calgary because I had a fairly large Calgary sample in here, but Toronto as well has experienced street flooding. Lots of other communities as well have done so. But that means 1 in 4 people have done this. So this is a pretty relatively, at least for this population, relatively frequently experienced event. And 51%, now this one I'm trying to figure out, 51% they'd experienced basement flooding in the last 10 years. So that's clearly a huge issue for a lot of people. Okay, so that's kind of telling you that our questions about willingness to pay are going to be salient because people have had experience. They're going to be able to answer the questions. Now, remember I said earlier that in my 2 slides on non-market valuation, there are kind of 2 ways of doing things. One is what I'm doing with a survey, kind of choice experiments, but the other is kind of the indirect approach where we kind of infer how valuable these things are to people based on their defensive or averting expenditures. Well, so we can actually look at that. We did ask people, you know, how much are you willing to pay, or how much did you spend? The problem is it's not directly necessarily related to the event. It could be for other purposes, and so it's hard to kind of attribute the amount. But it just to kind of give you some background context. So basically, in dealing with potential water outages, a lot of people purchase backup water. So either they'd have a case of water in their basement or they'd have like a big carboy. 2 and 3 people said they sent something in the last year. And the average spending was $75 a year, which I thought was actually pretty high. Now, here's where you have to worry a little bit about the outlier in your sample and the kind of average person. So the median spending, 50% of the sample spent 25% basically, so $25. So there are a bunch of people who spend a lot of money, and then there's kind of everybody else. But it's important to know that there is this kind of variation. In terms of dealing with potential flooding, we had a whole list of different kinds of activities that people could choose from. I'll just give you a couple of things. It was a number of ways. A simple one was, I have a safety plan. There were no costs associated with that, or at least they didn't say there were costs associated with that. There's time costs, but they didn't give that to us. All the way to major plans from kits. I'm not quite sure what I meant to say there. Clearly there's a typo there, but in many ways from plans to kits to major adjustments. Okay, I'm not even sure. I'm blanking on what I meant to say there. What were some of the major things? Oh, emergency kit, that was it. Emergency kit. Okay, so 1 in 9 people said they spent money on an emergency kit explicitly to deal with flooding. And the average spending was $127 with the median about $100. So there are a number of different things that could go in there. Number of people, 1 in 6 said they bought a sump pump explicitly to deal with flooding. I think they're all in Calgary after the flood. And the average spending was, this is an expensive ticket item, $630. There were people who said they made architectural changes to their house just so that they could reduce the adverse impacts of flooding. Those are very extreme responses, but that's important because one of the things that we really worry about when we do this kind of work is what we call heterogeneity. So in other words, people are different, and we want to be able to get at that kind of heterogeneity by looking at how their context, their specific context, and how they respond to different things. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about people's subjective perceptions. So we asked people then, first of all, we asked them, have you experienced an outage? And then we asked them, what do you think is the likelihood, the probability that your community would experience a water outage in the next, over the next 10 years? 1 in 5 people said, no, not going to happen to my community. So that's 20%, 1 in 5 people. On the other hand, 1 in 20 people, 5% said, going to happen 100%, absolutely. And so, you know, again, you've got this heterogeneity, and that's what makes people different. They have different perceptions of things, and they're going to react differently to things. Now, over the sample, they expressed about an 18% annual chance of water outage in their community, just kind of over the whole sample, with the median about a 10% annual chance. So remember, what we're going to be asking in our survey is a reduction in their belief of what that percentage is. This is just a little histogram so you can kind of see. So here are all the folks who basically said it's not going to happen to me. Here are all the folks who said, yeah, it's definitely going to happen to me. And then you can kind of see it kind of trails off, kind of what you'd expect. But there is a pretty big bump here at 50. People tend to anchor. I don't know if you've read any of Dan Kahneman's work, which is behavioral finance, actually, but it's all about how people behave. People kind of anchor on certain numbers. 50 was a big one. 100 was a big one that they kind of anchor on. We haven't done anything with this kind of distribution other than we've actually categorized people, and you'll see why in a minute, into different low, medium, high. So these would be kind of the low groups. We don't include the zeros in the low. We take them out of the sample, the low group, the kind of medium group, and then the high group in terms of where they kind of situate themselves in terms of their perceptions. Then in terms of the subjective perceptions of street flooding, almost 17% said there was no risk of their street flooding in the next 10 years. But about 3% of the sample said there was a 100% chance that their street would be flooded each year in the next 10 years. So they're the pessimists, I guess, or maybe they've just experienced lots of flooding in the past, so they know. And over the sample, the average annual percent chance of street flooding was about 14%, with a median of about 5%. So similar kind of diagram, but obviously more people who believe that it's not going to happen to them, but similar kind of people who are kind of in the low group, the medium, and then you've got a group of people who really believe that this is going to happen to them. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the actual questions that we ask people to elicit their willingness to pay. I've done a lot of background here where I've kind of set up the information we're trying to pull from people. But at the end of the day, what we really want to get at is, let's put a dollar value on what they say they would be willing to give up in exchange for a reduction in the probability of one of these adverse events happening. So we actually had two sets of valuation questions. We used a choice experiment format. And so the way the choice experiment format works, at least in our survey, there are different ways of doing it, but this is the kind of cleanest way to do it. You present people with what's called a status quo situation. It describes values for a number of different attributes associated with the status quo, and I'll show you a picture in a minute. And then you show them an alternative. And the alternative has, in our case, reductions in the risks associated with these particular events. We have, for those in the crowd who do this kind of work, it was a main effects design, so we had a status quo plus one alternative program for people to choose. And the idea then is that people look at the list of attributes, they look at the values in the status quo, the values in the alternative, and they decide, which one would I prefer? And always in the case of the alternative, there's a cost associated. This is what it's going to cost your household to get those benefits, to get those reductions in the risks. And you decide, do I stay with the status quo with the higher risks, or would I be willing to pay the money to get the reduced risks? That's the choice we're asking people to make. And at the end of the day, we get essentially a series of yeses or nos, yes to the program or no to the program, and then we model that. In our case, it's a random effects probit that you'll see in a minute. It's a discrete choice response. We model that, and we get out of that an estimated value for the willingness to pay. And we come up with one for avoiding outages, or reducing out, not avoiding, but reducing outages, and another one for reducing flooding. So just so you know what the attributes are, because this is really the heart of a choice experiment question, kind of how we structure the good. Now I want to take a step back for a second. I want you to think about when you go buy a good in a store, that good is not a homogeneous good. It's got a bunch of different attributes. And I've just recently bought a laptop. And I don't know if you've bought a laptop recently, but you have to decide, do I want, one with this hard drive, or one with this amount of RAM, or one with a backlit keyboard, or there are lots of different attributes associated with that. And of course, the pricing is different depending on what your attributes are. Well, same kind of thing with environmental goods. There are a number of different attributes associated with them, and so we want to kind of look at what those attributes might be. Now, part of the art of doing this kind of work is trying to figure out what are the attributes that people really care about. And so, we went through a series of focus groups where we basically had groups of 8 to 10 people, and we described for them situations, and we kind of figured out here are the things that they care about and are likely to respond to. So for our particular case, we thought about different types of adverse outcomes associated with water outages. One was an unexpected short-term water outage. One was an unexpected long-term outage, so basically 4 hours versus more than a day. And then another was boil water advisories that kind of were associated with that outage. So in each case, we looked at reducing the probability associated with each of those different events based on what people had said they thought their own subjective probability was. And then because we were kind of interested in finding out, did labels matter? And did the way the infrastructure was done matter? We described to people green infrastructure options versus so-called engineering infrastructure options, different ones in the two cases. And we kind of labeled them as such, and we told people what it might entail. And then finally, the last attribute is going to be an increase in your water bill. Now, this is called the payment vehicle in this literature, and it's basically how people express their willingness to pay. And it makes sense to say, okay, this is an infrastructure issue. How much of a surcharge are you willing to see on your existing water bill to kind of get this better infrastructure? So that's for the water outages problem. For the flooding willingness to pay, we had some slightly different attributes. The first one was a reduction in the probability of short-term street flooding, short-term being for a couple of hours, so your street floods for a couple of hours. And then because quite often when you get flooding, you also get power outages associated with the flooding on your street. We were also added in there the probability of a flooding-caused power outage. Quite often when you get flooding, you get boil water advisories associated with them as well. So we had a flooding-caused boil water advisory. And then finally, we added in there probability of basement flooding as well, in addition to the street flooding. And again, we asked the issue of the green versus the engineering infrastructure. And then finally, there would be the increase to the household water bill. So a number of different attributes that are going to vary, and that we're going to present people with what we call different scenarios. And the scenarios vary the attributes. And then we look and see, how do they respond under this situation? How do they respond under that situation? And if we vary the attributes to them, then they're having to make choices about things. And that way we kind of trace out what their preferences are, what we call eliciting their preferences. Just quickly what the attribute levels were. So we've got the attributes, what are their values? And people literally see numeric values for these things. So for status quo, that's the situation as it is, we pulled in people's self-reported probabilities of these different events, the different flooding events, and the different boil water advisory events. And for the household water bill, of course, there's no change. You have your water bill, there's no change to it, you continue on as is. And the alternative program described to people, to keep things really simple, we presented people with either a 50% reduction in their stated probability or a huge reduction, basically almost to zero, so a 99.1, what we called a 99.1% reduction. And we did this because we were interested in what we worry about is called the scale of people's responses. So in other words, this is clearly a bigger reduction. Do people respond with higher values, higher willingness to pay, because it's a bigger gain to them, a bigger benefit to them. Then we had either greener engineering infrastructure, and then finally, the way you get variation in these kinds of choice experiments is you vary the amount that you ask people to pay. And then you're looking to see, do they say yes to $50? Do they say yes to $100 for the list of attributes that they see? And so our values ranged from $10 to $250. This is an annual increase on their water bill, on their existing water bill. Okay, so green infrastructure, we had little pop-up boxes where they could pop up and look and see what it meant. Basically, we talked about restoring and protecting wetlands, creating buffer strips, permeable payments. Those were the types of green infrastructure components. And then for engineering, we talked more on the kind of the capital investment side of things. Okay, so this is a picture of what somebody saw. A lot of information presented here, but we kind of worked people up to this. By the time they actually got to this, they'd seen a lot of information already. this is it. This is a sample question. So let me kind of walk you through this and explain. So in this first column here, these are our attributes. Now this is a willingness to pay question about value of reducing floods. So we got our attributes in terms of flooding. So there's street flooding, basement flooding, boil water advisory arising from a flooding event, power loss due to flooding. Then we've got the method used to improve the management, green or engineering. And then finally, what the cost to people would be per household, starting very specifically, this was July 2016, we told them. So these are the different attributes. This is what we would call the status quo, or the current situation. Those values, 3%, 0, that was me running and doing that and taking screen captures. That would have been my perception of what I thought things were going to be like if no improvement were made. So I think there'd be a 3% chance in the next 10 years of having this particular event happen to me, a 0% chance of basement flooding, and so on and so on. And then what happened was, in our proposed program, depending on what people said here, they would see either a reduction to a half of all of those probabilities, or a reduction to 99.1%. To all of those probabilities. And then randomly, well, not exactly randomly, according to a design, they were, oh, sorry, you told me not to walk in front. They were, I guess I should just use this. It might be helpful if I use the capital opposed to the labor, right? Speaking about green and engineering infrastructure here. So here they were either shown green infrastructure or engineering infrastructure according to a design that we had. And then finally here they were shown, again, according to the design, either 10, 50, whatever amount. At the end of the day, we asked them one simple thing. Take a look at all of this and decide, would you vote against the proposed program? So in other words, you'd be voting for the status quo, or would you vote for the proposed program? You'd be voting for this alternative thing. People saw 2 of these for the outage question and 2 of these for the street flooding question. They were varied according to the different design elements, and then we used that information together. And so one person potentially could see green infrastructure for both of their questions, but they see different values. And so we'd be trying to tease out, what is the value of green infrastructure to them? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the econometrics and the results. So as I said, each respondent in our sample answered a total of 4 choice questions, 2 for the flooding situation, 2 for the outage situation. We model them separately for the moment. We may decide to model them jointly at some point, although they do have different numbers of attributes, and that does actually make a difference to our modeling. But at the moment, I'm just going to present the very simple model results. And essentially what we're modeling is their response, which is either I choose the alternative or I choose the status quo based on the characteristics that they saw, those attribute levels that they saw. Now, it turns out our data are kind of a panel type. In other words, we've got 2 sets of responses from each person for each of either flooding or outage. So for that reason, we estimated some random effects probits to kind of get at the fact that we've got this kind of panel data situation. This is to get at the heterogeneity. And we estimated separate random effects panels. And that we're just starting on this analysis. We haven't ended it by any means, so these are very preliminary results. A little bit more about the results before I show you some numbers. So we excluded respondents who said they had a 0 probability belief in all 4 or 3 of the categories. So it's no point in asking them how much they're willing to pay, because they've said, no, there's no chance of this happening, so not important. So we've excluded them, and that turned out to be about 20% of the sample. But that meant that 80% had some positive belief that these events were going to take place. So for the remainder of these respondents, you saw those histograms. We basically categorized people into 3 groups. We didn't use the numeric values because, in a second I'll talk about it, there's a potential endogeneity issue in terms of the explanatory variables, and we wanted to try to deal with that. And there are different ways we're going to be dealing with that in the future, but this is our first attempt at it. So we classified people into kind of people with low risk beliefs, medium, and high risk beliefs. And it turned out there were about equal numbers in the 3 groups. We didn't plan for it that way, but it turned out to be that way. So as I said, remember that if you think about what our model is, dependent variable, thing we're trying to explain is yes, no, I chose the alternative. My explanatory variables are the attributes. Now the problem is some of those attributes are self-reports, so there's an endogeneity there. So what we decided to do is, based on some work that Vic's been doing, basically what we did is we kind of created these indicator groups of risks, low, medium, high, and we interacted them with the 50% reduction or the 99.1% reduction, because that was random. People didn't know which one they were going to get. We know which group they were in. And so what that means is they can show that there is not this endogeneity problem. So what we've got then, and I apologize for this slide, but it's just so you can understand when you see the results. We created 6 dummy variables as ways of kind of being the explanatory variables in the model. And 3 of them are relating to the 50% risk reduction, and 3 of them are relating to the 99% risk reduction, and they are interacted with the low, medium, or high risk groups. So that's why we've got 6 categories. And just so you know, people with a low expressed risks were those who had risks that they believed to be less than 10%. Yeah, I'm almost done. And people with medium were kind of in the 11 to 30% range, and then people above were the ones that at the tail end there. Okay, so here are the coefficients for the models. Let me go over this very quickly, so I'll get to some numbers, because Royce told me I've got 5 minutes, so speaking about getting myself organized. The constant is the reference respondent who had a 50% risk reduction and is a low risk. The fact that it's positive and significant says that this person is predisposed to choose the alternative program. 50% reduction times medium risk, this would be the person with the medium risk view, but seeing that 50% reduction. That coefficient is added on to the first coefficient, so they've got an even higher chance or likelihood of responding yes to I want the alternative program. So positive coefficients, more likely to pick the alternative program. Just in a general sense, of course, people don't like to pay, so the higher cost meant they were less likely to pick the alternative program. Green infrastructure, very positive and very significant. If they saw green infrastructure, everything else being held constant, they were more likely to say yes to the alternative program. Remember, the contrast to that was over-engineering, right? So if they saw green, they liked it on this particular model. We did a couple of additional models with some covariates. Bottom line, people who had previously experienced an outage were more likely to pay. Older respondents were less likely to pay. And I need to investigate that a little bit more. That came up clearly in all of these different things. Okay, so what are the numbers? Remember the numbers I showed you earlier? The numbers range from a couple of dollars to about $40 a year for water outages. So basically this top number here, these are the people with the smallest risk reduction, so smallest good, and the lowest level of risk. They're coming in at about $49 a year per household for that risk reduction. If it's the engineering approach, and $72 a year if it's done with green infrastructure. So they're willing to pay, but they'd rather have it done through green infrastructure to deal with water outages. And those are statistically different from one another. Most of the other ones are not, so the green and the engineering are not statistically different in a number of different senses. But then when we get up to the people with basically the biggest good, the highest risk reduction, the highest perceived risk, we're talking almost double those numbers. So much higher willingness to pay. Here are the ones for the flooding. Similar kind of pattern going on here. Basically, there is a scale effect here. The bigger the risk reduction, the more people are willing to pay. The more risk you initially perceive, the more you're willing to pay. But no statistical difference on green or engineering. No, people don't want green to deal with their flooding. They want, I would say, equally green and engineering. There's no preference for the green here. Again, some additional models with covariates. Previous flood experience was not significant, which I thought was very interesting. However, if you are a female, you are much more likely to choose the alternative program. And apparently, the literature finds that. All of the flooding literature says that women are more likely to, you guys are all nodding, yeah. And again, older people less likely to pay. And the numbers are Basically, for the low level, they're no different from what they were for water outages. But by the time we get to like a big reduction in flooding risks for people who really have concerns, they've got much, much higher values than what we saw on outages. So let me go back. I'm almost done. Let me go back to that infrastructure report that I showed you. Remember what the estimated value of infrastructure per household was for potable water, just to do the replacement of the infrastructure? It's about $14,000. For wastewater is about just over 16. Well, what could we do? We asked people, how much would you be willing to pay each year for the next 10 years on your household water bill to pay for, these reduced risks? Now, it's obviously not tied explicitly to the infrastructure issue, but I just wanted to kind of do a comparison here. If we assume a 2% discount rate, which is probably about right now, then the present value of that willingness to pay per household for water reliability would range between $440 a year and $1,100, depending upon both people's risk levels and also the degree of the good. And the present value of the willingness to pay for households for reduced flooding would obviously be on the high end a little bit higher because of those people who really worry about floods. Just remember, these are in addition to the existing water bill. So what are some conclusions here? What do we find? There's sensitivity definitely to the scale of risk reduction. People are willing to pay more for a 99% reduction than a 50% reduction. Risk reductions, though, tend to be more relevant for the flooding. That we see really big differences in those values there. Green infrastructure, favored to deal with outages, but not flooding. And a really strong result, women are just more likely to be willing to pay for reduced flooding risks. And as I said, the other literature finds this. Where are we going with this? We want to look more at heterogeneity of preferences, and we want to do something more with incorporating those defensive expenditures as kind of the background context. Okay, and just to show you that random stuff happens, this was my backyard 2 days ago when we got 30 centimeters of snow in Niagara. This is my barbecue. So, we worry about floods and things like that. Nobody really saw the snow. Well, they did see the snowstorm coming, but they really didn't think it was going to be that bad. So anyway, randomness here in water. I'm done.
Thank you very much. So we have some time for questions.
Yeah.
So it was a really interesting talk, but actually you showed the numbers, mean and median value.
Mm-hmm.
So should we take mean seriously or median seriously, or which should we basically implement?
That's a good question. Which should we implement? I'm trying to think. Do you mean which should the government implement?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think the government has that degree of control over those two things, to be honest. I think what the government can do is kind of choose a target. Whether it will fit the mean or the median is another matter. My guess is it would probably go, if we think about kind of like voting models, they probably go for the median voter. That's typically what voting models tell us, right? You go for the median voter, so you maybe make very angry the people at the high end, but you get the median voter. And I guess the election maybe just recently in the Netherlands shows us maybe the median voter kind of got captured in that election too. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that people were willing to pay more for green infrastructure for outages.
Yes.
What was the green for outages? What was the green infrastructure?
So
that they were willing to pay more for?
So we were taught, it was a generic kind of thing. We said examples of green infrastructure are, for example, like swales along rivers and not, in other words, not doing more capital expansion.
But that's water outages.
For water, no, yeah.
So I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of your talk.
Okay.
So how do you define a water outage?
Oh, sorry. So water outage was a reduction in your water, so your water supply shuts off for a short period of time or for a day or whatever.
So that's the only way you get the water in your house is by pipes. So swales
Yes,
wouldn't have an.
but more in terms of when we think about the long-term supply availability and how a community is going to kind of structure the more reliable water supply coming into the city. That was what we explained to them.
Source water.
Yes, it was like
Distribution.
yes, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there any way you can control for you're asking people beforehand if they've experienced floods before, so on and so forth. If they have, and if they see this as a failure of the municipality, they may not be willing to pay
Yeah,
much, and that
yeah.
will put downward pressure on the willingness to pay figures you
Yeah.
have.
Yeah, I didn't show it here, but Monica knows very well. A number of years ago, I've done a number of water surveys, and I've always asked people, what do you think of the reliability of your water system? And it's not very good. And I haven't done anything with it. I asked it here, although the numbers were better on this one. So it used to be that something like more than 50% of the people would say, I don't trust my water supplier to provide me with reliable water. Now it's down to about 40%. So it's improving, but I haven't done anything with it, but that clearly is a context issue that we
If you
can.
don't have data, you can just control for voting preferences across the districts. If they chose over the status quo, that may...
Yeah. Well, I do have the data. I just haven't done anything with. Oh no, I do have it. I just haven't modeled their response in. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Did you include people that have their own homes? And they're-
No, we explicitly asked them if they were on a city water system, and we only included folks who were on city water system. Obviously, that would be a whole other set of issues that you'd have to worry about. Yeah. I saw a hand. Mhm.
So in Australia, I spent some time in Australia last year, and they're highly regulatory bodies. So every 5 years, they have to reapply for their license. And part of their license, they have to do a survey. So they've been annual surveys of what people will pay for and what their expectation level is. The response, from my understanding of the surveys, is they're willing to pay for more every year, but they're also willing to expect less of the system,
Oh, that's
which
interesting.
is
Yeah.
which is a surprise, because as they get more educated about the system, they realize on an annual basis that they're doing the survey that the performance of the system, even though they're going to pay more, it's not even to maintain the existing performance. Perception goes down. So you may want to kind of
Yeah.
look at some of
Is that the more? No, is that Cicero who does that?
No, every water.
Oh, the water utilities themselves.
Water utilities
Okay.
have to do it in order to be able to
Okay.
get a license.
Okay.
Go through WASA for the WASA, the
Yeah.
utilities organization. I can get
Okay. Yeah. That would be very. Yeah, that would be very interesting.
They're
I've
doing a ton of surveys and to get, to this issue of like customer
satisfaction. Yeah.
expectation, as opposed to which
Right.
doesn't got a lot of information on that.
Okay. Yeah. No, that would be very good. Thank you. That's very helpful. Yeah.
I have a question. So it was about the designing the survey.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned the different levels and the attributes, and you assigned some values for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how did you come up with the values? Like, did you do the expert judgment, or looking at the?
These were people's values. No, these were people's values. They were not expert judgment. We actually asked people. We said, "What do you think is the likelihood that this is going to happen to you?"
No, I was asking about the, like, from the designing level. So
Yeah.
if you go back to the attributes,
Right.
you say, okay, how much?
Oh, the 50% or 99%? Oh, it was purely it was for ease of scale. Just 50% reduction, 99% reduction. It was just easier to kind of express those to people.
Yeah,
As a
lot of
reduction.
Probabilities
Yeah.
in the first place already. So.
Yeah, these are probabilities that we're asking people, so we're reducing their probability by half and reducing it to basically zero.
So for the
Why did we pick those? Why did we pick 50 and 99? We could have picked 30 and 70. We wanted a big scale because we wanted a small change and a big change. And so the changes were kind of, why did we pick them? Just for ease of presenting to people.
So my question is, like, if you do a real survey and when we present to the prospective respondents about a scenario with the status quo level,
Right.
do they understand what is meant by the status quo level? So based on that, maybe they will have a behavioral judgment, right? So when you explain, okay, you have a 3% chance of having floods, you have 2% chance of power outage. So
Yeah.
do they understand these numbers?
Yeah, we asked them a series of questions to see whether they had the cognitive understanding and about a lot of these things especially when you ask probability questions, something like 10% of the people don't understand fractions and they don't understand probabilities, and you just model that in. But other people, they did. They answered right, I guess I should say. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, please.
In Ontario, I look at the parallel energy and the prices going up, and with the green energy and nuclear energy and whatever, the electric bills has gone up high, and there doesn't seem to be too much of a willingness on people's parts to pay the bill, and I would be one of them. I would say they've gone up quite a bit. So obviously, I don't know if they've done any surveys to when the prices went up, but there must be some kind of upper limit as to what the willingness to pay is for the general populace, or these surveys. Can you design surveys where you can tease out, on the water side now, I work for a municipality, how much willingness to pay, because our rates, locally, our rates go up to, similar to Toronto. How much can people take in terms of the willingness to pay? Is there some way of finding that out more accurately through these surveys?
There are different.
Like how much is enough? And maybe that's
Right.
what we have to start thinking really hard about.
Well, if you're kind of describing the same scenario, like the same good to people, there are what they call kind of bidding games in this kind of survey work, where you basically ratchet up. If someone says yes to $10, and you ratchet it up to $20, and you ratchet it up to $30. There are behavioral problems with that kind of approach, though. So it's the other approach is to basically say, what's the most you'd be willing to pay? But that's also got issues with it. The most I've ever seen is kind of Ian's stuff where he's got like triple bounds, but I mean, even that's.
So here you can look at the share of people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so basically what,
That gives you some kind of indication.
yeah, it's like a demand curve, basically. You look and see how many,
About the York Region study.
Yeah, yeah.
Elasticity, they might be really interested in that.
yeah, oh yeah, okay, there's some work that we've done where we've looked at elasticity of demand, which is sort of another way of getting at it. You can't really do it within the context of this type of thing. But so what you do when you set up the values, like the $10 to $2.50, you don't want to choke off demand to zero, because that's not enough information. So we usually go for around choking off demand to about 10% of the sample says no to that, or sorry, yes to that, rather. So I guess my short answer to that is you could never pinpoint the exact highest value, but you could get within an approximation of it.
One more question.
Yeah.
So even within Canada, there are differences in pricing structure. Because I look here, my water is metered, I pay according to that. I was in Quebec where my parents are, they just pay it.
Oh yes, Quebec is it's its own, yeah.
I'm wondering if there were differences in terms of the willingness to pay related to the pricing structure, depending on where people were located.
I haven't looked into that. All of these homes were on some kind of city metering system. Did I ask? I didn't ask them how they paid their water bill, but certainly that's a very good point, because I can go back and have a look at that and see. Certainly we know just from anecdotal evidence that there are different elasticities of responses depending upon what these things look like. But yeah, that could be something that we could add in. I have information on where people are located, so I can easily add that in. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that would actually be interesting, because there have been, even over the last few years, changes from flat to some kind of scaled metering type of thing going on. So, yeah, that's a good point.
Is there a high awareness of what they were currently paying for water?
And I didn't ask in this one, but generally no. The answer is no. I remember the first survey I did about 10 years ago, we asked people, do you know what your water bill is? And they're going, beats me. You know, I think there's much more awareness now. Certainly in Toronto, as I said, they've been raising their prices 8 to 10% a year. So I think people are much more aware of water bills now.